My father called me on Thanksgiving morning to tell me he was done with me. Not angry done, not screaming done. The quiet administrative kind of done, like he was closing an account that had stopped being profitable. I've decided the family dynamic isn't healthy, he said, and I could hear football in the background and the clink of ice in a glass. We're simplifying things going forward. Just your brother and me. I think it's best you have space to figure out your own path. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was standing in my kitchen in Richmond, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold while I'd been waiting for the turkey base timer to go off. The base timer I'd set for the dinner I'd been planning to drive to. The dinner I'd bought groceries for. I was supposed to arrive at noon with sweet potato casserole and a bottle of wine. Okay, I said. I hope you understand. I do, I said. I understand completely. I hung up. I set the mug down. I picked up my phone again and called Dara. I need you in the office, I said when she answered. Today. Petra, it's Thanksgiving. I know, I'm sorry. I'll explain everything. Can you pull up the Hawthorne Hill file? 45 minutes later, I was signing paperwork. The sale had been in motion for 3 weeks already. I had been watching Hawthorne Hill Farm since the day my grandmother's estate went into probate, since the day my brother was handed the executor's role by my father, and I saw the shape of what was coming. A developer from Northern Virginia had made a verbal offer in September. My brother had been enthusiastic. My father had started talking about liquidating assets at every family dinner, which I had attended, and smiled through and said nothing. I had $340,000 in a money market account. I had another $80,000 in a brokerage. I had not spent recklessly. I had not loaned carelessly, not for a long time. I knew what the farm was worth, and I knew what the developer was willing to pay, and I knew that if I moved first, I could buy it in a private sale before probate finalized, using a clause my grandmother had written into her estate documents herself, years before she died. A clause that said any direct descendant could purchase the property at fair market value before any third-party sale was executed, provided they filed the proper paperwork within 60 days of the estate opening. My grandmother was a retired paralegal. She had thought of everything. My brother had 33 days left on that clock when my father called to release me from the family on Thanksgiving morning. I had been waiting for an excuse. He just gave me the cleanest one possible. I signed the last page. Dara notarized it. I transferred the funds. I didn't go to anyone's dinner that night. I drove 2 hours west into the Shenandoah Valley and sat in a farmhouse kitchen with a gas burner that took 4 tries to light and a window that looked out onto 40 acres of frost-covered fields. And I ate a granola bar and drank cold coffee from a thermos and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Like I could breathe. Hawthorne Hill Farm was everything my grandmother had been. Quiet, stubborn, rooted deep. The house was old, maybe 1940s, with thick stone walls and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides and creaked in a way that was almost musical. The fields had been leased to a neighboring cattle operation for the last decade, but you could still see where the original planting rows had been. Straight lines pressed into the earth, like the farm remembered what it used to do. There was a hawthorn tree at the property line, the one the farm was named for, older than the house by at least a century. My grandmother used to take me there on summer visits when I was small. She'd put her hand on the bark and tell me that some things in this world just endure, whether people pay attention to them or not. I thought about her a lot that first night. I sat on the porch wrapped in a moving blanket I'd found in the hall closet, watching the darkness settle over the fields, and I didn't feel her absence the way I had since the funeral. I felt her presence. The way you feel it when you're in a place that still holds the shape of someone. The next morning, I started working. I'm a corporate auditor. I spend my days inside the financial statements of mid-sized companies, looking for the places where numbers don't quite add up. Discrepancies between what a business reports and what it actually does. Patterns that look random until you see them from the right angle. People think it's boring work, but what it actually is patient work. You look at everything. You wait for the picture to form. You don't flinch when it does. I applied that same patience to the farm. I ordered 2 weather-resistant security camera systems online and drove back out on Saturday to install them myself. One on the front porch eave, angled to cover the driveway and the gate. One on the back corner of the house, covering the barn access and the side field road. I ran the wiring through the exterior conduit, sealed the connections against the November cold, tested the signal on my phone app twice. Then I drove to the hardware store in town and bought 2 sets of heavy deadbolts, Schlag commercial grade, and replaced every exterior lock on the property. The old keys, 3 of them, went into a tin box in the truck's center console. I did not give copies to anyone. While I was driving back from the hardware store, my phone rang. My brother's name on the screen. I let it ring. Then my father. I let that ring too. Then a number I didn't recognize, and then my stepmother, who never called me directly ever. That one gave me a small, cold satisfaction that I allowed myself to feel for about 30 seconds before I put the phone in the glove box and finished the drive. That evening, I opened the spreadsheet I had been keeping for 4 years. I had named it the accounting, and I had never shown it to anyone. The first entry was from when I was 24. My brother had totaled his car and lost his license in the same weekend. My father called me not to tell me, but to tell me what I was going to do about it. $7,000 for a used truck. A loan, my father said. He did not mean it as a loan. I knew that, but I was 24, and I still believed that love required proof. So I wrote the check. The truck was repossessed 18 months later because my brother had never registered it in his name, and somehow none of this was ever discussed. There was the $22,000 I wired to my father when his contracting business hit a cash flow problem in 2019. Just until the Henderson contract clears, he said. The Henderson contract cleared. He took a vacation to Scottsdale with my stepmother instead. There was the $6,500 for my brother's DUI attorney. There was the $4,000 for the move he made to Phoenix that lasted 11 weeks. There was the $18,000 my grandmother had quietly told me about in the last year of her life. Money my father had borrowed from her using a document she'd signed without understanding what it was. She had trusted her son. I had spent 6 months trying to decide what to do with that information, and then she died and I didn't have to decide anymore. Total, $57,500, over 8 years. Not counting the time, not counting the Thanksgivings I had organized and the Christmas gifts I had bought for everyone and the medical forms I had helped my father navigate after his shoulder surgery. Not counting the years of showing up, of being needed, of making myself useful enough that no one thought to ask if I was okay. 60 miles away, my brother had been named executor of the estate of a woman who, when she was alive, had loved me more consistently than anyone else in my life. And he was about to sell her farm to cover the losses of a sports bar that had been bleeding money since the day it opened. I closed the spreadsheet. The numbers were clear. The picture had formed. I had not bought this farm out of sentiment, though the sentiment was real. I bought it because I understood finally that there was no conversation left to have. There was no version of explaining myself that would change anything. Men like my father don't respond to reason. They respond to closed doors. So I closed one. I turned $420,000 in liquid assets into 40 acres of Virginia earth with my name on the deed, and I watched the path that money used to travel get cut off permanently. They would come. I knew they would come. I just had to wait. For 5 weeks, there was nothing. My father did not call again after the first few days. My brother texted twice, once to ask if I had heard anything from the estate lawyer, which I found interesting, and once to forward me a meme about family forgiveness that I read once and deleted. The silence settled over everything like a second winter, heavy and still, the kind that sits behind your eyes. I worked remotely from the farmhouse, auditing a medical equipment distributor whose CEO had a curious habit of categorizing personal ski trips as client development. I drove into the nearest town for groceries twice a week. I learned the name of the woman who ran the feed store, Helen, who had known my grandmother since the 90s, and who pressed a small jar of her own honey into my hands the second time I came in without being asked. I learned that the cattle farmer leasing my fields was named Dale, that he had been leasing from my grandmother for 11 years, that he had cried at her funeral. I learned that the county sheriff, a man named Boone, had eaten breakfast at the Route 11 diner every Thursday morning with my grandmother for the last 3 years of her life. He had heard I bought the farm and left a voicemail introducing himself. I called him back. We talked for 20 minutes. I want to be clear about something. I had not planned a trap. I had planned a life. The cameras were there because I was a woman living alone on a rural property, and I am not naive. The new locks were there because I understood that I wasn't the only person who knew this farm existed. The documentation was there because I am an auditor and I document everything. Dara knew the full picture because she is my attorney and my oldest friend, and I trust her with the things that matter. When they came, I was ready not because I had laid a snare. I was ready because I had been paying attention. That is what I have always done. They just never noticed. It was a Tuesday in late December. Cold gray sky, the kind of day that never quite gets light. I was at the kitchen table reviewing a balance sheet when the camera alert buzzed on my phone. I looked at the screen. A dark blue pickup truck I didn't recognize. Then my father's Tahoe pulling in behind it. They parked in the turnaround in front of the porch and they came out in layers. My father first in the coat he wore when he wanted to be taken seriously. My brother next, hands in his jacket pockets, looking around the property with a slow turn of his head. That particular scan of a person who has already decided a place belongs to them and is just confirming the inventory. Then the man from the truck. Late 40s, padded vest, leather portfolio under his arm, measuring tape clipped to his belt. The developer. The same man who had made the verbal offer in September. My brother pulled out his phone and started photographing the exterior of the house. The developer was already pacing the fence line near the barn, looking out at the fields, nodding slowly to himself. My father walked up the porch steps and reached into his breast pocket. He produced a key. Not a new key. Old brass, the kind that came with a lock you'd find in a rural hardware store 20 years ago. My grandmother's original spare. He had found it somewhere, a junk drawer, a box from the estate, a coat pocket from a visit years ago. It didn't matter where. He was holding it with the ease of a man who believed that possession of the key meant possession of everything the key used to open. He slid it into the deadbolt. It didn't turn. He tried again, firmer. He pulled it out, looked at it, tried once more. Then he straightened and looked at the door like it had done something offensive. He called my brother over. My brother tried the key. Same result. The developer came up onto the porch, and all three of them stood there looking at the front door of my house, like it was a problem that required collective solving. I watched on my phone screen. I was sitting completely still at the kitchen table, coffee in my hand 25 feet away. My father pulled out his phone and made a call. He paced the length of the porch, talking, the estate attorney probably, trying to confirm his access rights. My brother went back down into the yard, still taking pictures, working his way around the side of the house. He came close to the kitchen window. He cupped his hands against the glass and peered in, the way people do when they think no one is home. He was looking directly at the third camera, the one I had added as an afterthought, mounted on the interior windowsill, and I watched through the screen as the recognition moved across his face. Confusion first, then something else. He stepped back fast. I stood up. I pressed the button labeled Relay in my security app. No alarm, no siren. Just a signal that went out to the text chain I had set up with Dara and Sheriff Boone 11 days earlier. Then I walked to the front door and opened it from the inside. My father startled. He hadn't heard me coming. He still had the key in his hand. Petra, he said, and then stopped, because he didn't have a sentence prepared for this particular situation. Hi, I said. The developer had come back up onto the porch, and my brother was behind my father now, and all three of them were looking at me with the specific expression of people who have been caught doing something they fully believed they had the right to do. Not guilt. Confusion. The quiet indignity of an expectation not being met. We were going to knock, my father said. You tried the lock first, I said. I watched on the camera. The key wasn't. Because I changed the locks 6 weeks ago. I looked at my brother. I also saw you photographing the exterior. Is that for the listing, or is the developer running his own documentation? The developer shifted his portfolio. I was just doing a preliminary walk. This property is not for sale, I said. It hasn't been since November 28th. My father's expression hardened into the face I had known my entire life, the one that meant he had decided I was being unreasonable and that this was something he would simply push through. The estate is still in probate. As executor, your brother has authority over estate assets. Had, Dara said. She came around the side of the house from the back field path, her wool coat gray against the winter pale grass, her black briefcase held at her side. She had driven from Richmond that morning and parked at the feed store as I had asked, and walked the half-mile trail along the fence line without complaint. She climbed the porch steps and set the briefcase on the railing. Dara Finch, attorney for the property owner. She handed my father a document from the first folder. Hawthorne Hill Farm was purchased in a private sale on November 28th under the terms of the estate instrument for Clara Beaumont, specifically Article 7, subsection C. That clause granted any direct lineal descendant the right of first purchase at appraised fair market value prior to any third-party transaction. My client filed the necessary paperwork with the probate court on November 23rd, 5 days before the sale executed. The executor and the estate attorney were both notified by certified mail. My brother stared at the document. Nobody told us. The court notified you, Dara said, with the pleasant, unhurried tone she used in depositions. Your name is on the certified mail receipt. Return signature was never provided. He hadn't opened it. I had known he wouldn't. He had told me years ago that he didn't open official mail because it was always bad news, and he preferred to handle things only when they became unavoidable. It was one of the most honest things he had ever said about himself. He had handed away his one legal advantage, because he couldn't bring himself to look at an envelope. My father lowered his voice. The strategy shift I knew was coming. Petra, this farm belongs to the whole family. Your grandmother never meant for you to take it for yourself. She would have wanted. She wrote the clause herself, I said, in 2020. She told me about it in August, 3 months before she died. She asked me specifically to use it if the estate went the way she was afraid it might go. I paused. She wrote down her wishes and had them notarized. This is exactly what she wanted. I heard gravel before I saw headlights. Sheriff Boone's cruiser rolled up the driveway slow and steady, and stopped behind my father's Tahoe. He climbed out with no particular urgency, a big man, silver-haired, moving with the kind of unhurried calm that comes from 3 decades of knowing what situations actually require. Mr. Beaumont, he said, nodding to my father. He looked at the portfolio in the developer's hands, at the 3 of them on the porch, at me in the doorway. Petra, you doing all right? I'm fine, Sheriff. Thank you for coming out. Wouldn't be anywhere else. He looked back at my father, and when he spoke, His voice was still easy, still conversational, but there was nothing soft in it. I want to be straightforward with you about what I'm looking at here. You attempted to enter a private residence using a key that no longer corresponds to the current locks. The property owner did not grant you permission to be on this land. The developer behind you is conducting site assessments on a property he has no legal standing to assess. He stopped there for a moment, letting that settle. I also want to mention that I knew Clara Beaumont for a long time. Ate breakfast with her most Thursdays. She was one of the sharpest people I've met in 30 years of this work. She talked about this farm often. She was real clear about what she wanted done with it. My father's face did something I had never seen it do. It went through the motions of confidence and came out the other side with nothing to show. He looked at my brother. My brother was still holding Dara's document, turning it slowly, like if he kept looking a different paragraph might surface. This is a family misunderstanding, my father said. We came to have a conversation about the estate. You brought a developer with a measuring tape, I said, and you tried the lock before you knocked. The developer had quietly and steadily taken several steps back toward the porch stairs. He had closed his portfolio and tucked it under his arm and was reassessing the shape of his morning. My father made one more attempt. He told the sheriff that I had manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman, that my grandmother had not been of sound mind when she added the clause that the sale should be invalidated on grounds of undue influence. He said it with the fluency of a man who had learned that confident delivery often travels further than actual evidence. Dara was already opening the second folder. Clara Beaumont's estate attorney commissioned a formal capacity evaluation at her own request in June of last year, she said. She was assessed as fully competent by 2 independent physicians. The clause in question was added to her estate instrument in 2020, 3 years before her death. She held up a document in a clear protective sleeve. She also left a notarized letter of intent with her attorney, specifically addressing her wishes for this property and identifying her granddaughter by name as the intended beneficiary of the right of first purchase. The original is with the probate court. I have a certified copy here. Sheriff Boone looked at my father steadily. Sir, if you file a formal complaint alleging fraud or undue influence in connection with this sale, and that complaint is found to be without factual basis, you're looking at a Class 1 misdemeanor for filing a false report. I'd think carefully before you go down that road. My father said nothing. My brother said quietly, to no one in particular, what happens to us? Do we just leave? You're on private property without the owner's permission, the sheriff said. Yes, all 3 of you need to leave, right now. My father set the old brass key on the porch railing. He didn't throw it. He set it down with the deliberate steadiness of a man trying to retain some shred of dignity in a situation that had been stripped of all possible exits. He looked at me for a long moment, the look that had always worked before, the one that said I was making things harder than they needed to be, that I was being difficult, that the reasonable thing was to step aside. I looked back at him and didn't move. You planned this, he said. I bought a farm, I said. You're the ones who drove 2 hours to sell it without mentioning it to me. He went down the steps. My brother followed, not making eye contact with me or the sheriff, his gaze fixed on the gravel. The developer was already at his truck. All 3 vehicles reversed down the driveway, and the gate swung shut behind the last one, and then there was nothing left but the sound of engines fading out toward the main road. Sheriff Boone leaned back against his cruiser and let out a slow breath that went white in the cold air. Your grandmother would have gotten a real kick out of that, he said. I think she planned most of it, I said. I just had to show up. He laughed, a deep, unhurried laugh that fit the afternoon perfectly. Dara came to stand beside me on the porch steps. The field was quiet. The hawthorn tree at the property line stood exactly where it always had, dark branches against the gray sky. Estate should close in about 6 weeks, she said. Once it does, the property transfers to you free and clear. I nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then, your brother called my office last week. Wanted to know whether there was any avenue to contest the purchase. What did you tell him? I told him the clause was ironclad, and that his grandmother put it there herself in sound mind and with specific intent. She paused. I also told him that as executor, his failure to open certified legal notice constituted a breach of fiduciary duty, and that the estate attorney had already been notified of the documentation. I looked at her. No criminal exposure, she said. But he won't be named executor of any estate in this state again. The probate court keeps records. That follows a person. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, but I heard what it meant underneath. He had been handed a responsibility that required the bare minimum of showing up, and he had not managed even that. It was enough. It was exactly enough. My phone had been vibrating in my pocket at intervals for the last half hour. I could feel it like a pulse, persistent, unwilling to stop. I pulled it out. My father twice, my brother once, my stepmother once, all in the last 20 minutes. I went into the settings. I blocked them one by one, the way you close windows before a storm, not with anger. With the same steady focus I bring to any reconciliation, making sure the numbers balance, making sure nothing is left open that should be closed. Dara stayed for dinner. I found a cast iron skillet in the back of the lower cabinet, and we made scrambled eggs and toast and opened a bottle of wine I'd been keeping in the pantry for no particular occasion. We sat at the kitchen table while the dark came down outside, and she told me about a contract dispute she was working through. And I told her about the medical equipment CEO and his creative interpretation of business travel. And for a while, it was just two people talking in a warm kitchen while the night settled in around the farmhouse. Later, I sat on the porch alone, wrapped in my grandmother's old quilt from the cedar chest upstairs, cream-colored with a faded blue star pattern, worn soft at the edges from decades of use. The stars were out. The field was still. The hawthorn tree at the property line was just a shape against the dark, but I knew exactly where it was and how it would look in the morning when the light came back. My grandmother had put her hand on its bark and told me that some things just endure. She was right about that, and now finally so would I.